So in our nation, for the longest time, we've had the ability to worship God freely, haven't we? As a people without any repercussions from society. And we've had Christian radio stations. Probably find 5 on our channels right now up here. And we have churches on every corner. Any flavor you like. We went to a church out in Newport for a while, and the pastor always said churches are so close you couldn't throw a cat without hitting one. So I don't know, that's just some backwoods pastor saying, but churches on every corner, right, is what we have. We have big churches and little churches. We have exciting churches and not so exciting churches. We have pastors who think they're rock stars now. And we have ministers who have been grinding it out decade after decade in a small backwoods congregation, being faithful. We have Christian t-shirts. We have Christian bumper stickers on our cars. We have Christian tattoos. We have everything. We're able to bow our head before our meal in a restaurant. We have the freedom to do that without worrying about having to go to jail over it. We've been very free for a very long time in this nation. But what if that day comes when all of that changes? What if the day comes when it costs you something to be a Christian in this nation, to be associated with Jesus, or you have to cover up that tattoo, or you have to take that bumper sticker off? It does for many of our brothers and sisters around the world. They're dealing with that today. They can't be open about serving Christ. But in our character study, the 2 men in our passage today, I believe we're going to find an example of how to follow, an example to follow when it comes to being affiliated with Jesus. We've been looking the last few weeks at the view of the cross from the disciple John. And it's not really been an exhaustive take, but to do that, I would encourage you, because there's a lot of things I didn't bring up, or you may say, well, I remember this happening. Read all 4 of the Gospels. Sit down, find the crucifixion account, and read all 4 of the Gospels together in one sitting, and then you'll get a good overview of what's happening. And it's going to bring up some questions. It's going to cause you to have to study. Well, I thought this said that. Well, what happened here? And so it causes you to dig in. But we've been looking through John's view in the last few weeks. In our passage today, we find ourselves after Jesus has given up his Spirit, and he's fulfilled, we've pointed out, down to the letter of Scripture, all of the prophecies concerning his death. His lifeless body is now hanging on a tree there on that cross. And the Jewish leaders, they want him taken down. That's what we looked at last week. They're concerned that his body hanging on that tree or cross will disgrace the Passover feast. And so according, and they're right, their Old Testament law, Deuteronomy 21, we looked at that. It said if a man is put to death and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain there overnight, but you shall surely bury him that day. And so we looked at all that last week, why they were concerned with getting his body down. And it's a prescription written for the Jewish people 1,500 years before Jesus. And it was given as a standard for the Jewish people for burial, for those who paid their debt to society. Because that was why they would be hung on the tree, was capital punishment is what it was. But we do know that Jesus wasn't paying his debt to society, was he? He was paying the debt for society. He was paying for our sin, not for his sin. That was the difference. So with that, we're introduced to the first character of our day today. Verse 38 said, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. Mark's gospel, when you read that, adds that when Joseph asked Pilate for Jesus' body, that Pilate was amazed. It says that Jesus has already died. John doesn't point that out, but Mark says when he went to him, Pilate was like, what? He's already dead? I can't believe it. And Jesus was no weak man. More than likely a carpenter growing up, because his stepfather, Joseph, his earthly father, had been a carpenter, and that was the way you lived. Whatever your family did, that's what you did. So more than likely, Jesus was a carpenter. And that was the day when you had to go get your own 2x4s, right? No Lowe's, no Home Depot, no local. You want wood? You climb the mountain, cut the tree down, haul it back, hew it down, right? So that was Jesus's basic, that's the way he lived. So he was no weak man, is my point. And Pilate's amazed. We just beat him, worse than we've beat anybody else. I couldn't believe he took it like that. We went out there and he ain't been out there that long and you're telling me he's already dead? This is what he says. Pilate responds. I personally believe that Jesus died so quickly to keep with the schedule of the 3 days and 3 nights that we talked about last week, and to fulfill the prophetic. Once that was finished, it was time to go, right? Why stay? What was the last thing Jesus said from the cross? A couple weeks ago we pointed out, tetelestai, right? Which means it is finished. That was the last thing he said. Took a drink. The only time he took a drink to be able to clear his throat enough, I believe, to be able to say that clearly so it was heard. It is finished. So during this time, there was legitimate reason to be afraid of being associated with Jesus in Israel, at least in the world's eyes. These guys, there's a reason that they would be afraid. There's a reason that they've been kind of staying behind the scenes, the two guys in our passage today. John 12:42, it says this, even among the rulers, many believed in him, speaking of Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him lest they should be put out of the synagogue. And why? For they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. So this is a passage from earlier. Listen to what it said, even among the rulers. So more than likely, speaking of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and probably some other guys. But it says that they were afraid to confess him because they'd be put out of the synagogue. And then it goes on and says, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. John is saying that those who believed in Jesus wouldn't confess him openly of these leaders because they feared man. They were afraid of man. They were more concerned with what men thought about them than what the Creator, what God thought about them. Yeah, we do that, don't we? I mean, I do it. You're in the flesh. I don't want to do it, and I'm trying to. Today's message is about not doing that. But the reality is, if we're not careful, we're more concerned about what people think about us than what God in heaven thinks about us. Very easy to fall into. The positions that these guys held, both of them, their financial standing. And like so many of us at times, they were too concerned with whatever others thought about them. And as a side note, let me say this to put in our back pocket and keep. I assure you, when we stand before Jesus and this is all wrapped up, no one else is going to stand by our side to explain why we did the things we did. We will be there answering, So remember that. Remember that if you're concerned about what other people think about you, if you share the gospel or not, or how you go through this life, if you're ashamed of Jesus, you'll stand there and answer for that yourself. And in him, if you're in him, then we're not going to be judged and cast into the lake of fire, but we will be judged according to our works as a Christian. And if you are ashamed of him, he has something to say about that too. Jesus said in Mark, whoever is ashamed of me and my words. Now, that's always stood out to me. You always kind of, if you quote it, it's easy to remember, if you're ashamed of me, I'll be ashamed of you. But he adds, if you're ashamed of me and my words. That's what we're facing today as Christians. If you say anything against homosexuality or anything against abortion or anything, then society just looks at you like you're an evil person, right? You're a hater. You're a hater. And Jesus said, if you're ashamed of me and my words, he goes on, in this adulterous and sinful generation of him, if you're ashamed, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of you when he comes in the glory of his Father and with his holy angels. It's a very clear declaration of how we as believers are to live this life for our Lord. Very clear. Fear kept these guys, these two men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, kept them from being open about their belief in Jesus up to this point. Joseph of Arimathea, we read in Mark 15, was a prominent council member. The guy had a position. He's a leader, Everybody knows who he is. He's got a position. This council that he speaks of, it was the Sanhedrin. You probably heard that word before. And the Sanhedrin was a group of 71 men who oversaw political, religious, and judicial functions of the Jewish people. And so he's one of the big dogs in town, right? Very high position. Joseph had a very important spot among the people. a position not so easy to step away from. When you have a lot, it costs you a lot to be associated with Jesus. I think, these judges, you read that he was in a way a judge. I think about what's going on in our nation with this election fraud, and I've kind of watched time and time again, people bring evidence and go before the court and file a lawsuit. And what happens? What's happening? It's the same problem. I'm not going to take it. I'm not going to look at it. Why? Because it's going to cost them something. It might cost them something. It might cost them everything. Threats, physical threats, threats against their family. And so I want to be sensitive to that, I still think you have to find your spine and stand on principle when that time comes. But we see it today. Unwilling to take a stand because it's going to cost you something. Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple, we read of Jesus. When Jesus, you remember when he healed the blind man by the pool of Siloam? The rulers were angry at Jesus because he healed the man on the Sabbath, we read. And the leaders called the man's parents, if you remember the story, and asked them, "Is this your son? And how does he now see?" They wanted to know. Tell us, is this him? And John writes the response from the parents. He says, they said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we don't know. He's of age, ask him. He'll speak for himself." And he goes on, here's what I'm getting at. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that Jesus was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogues. Therefore, his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." Right? You remember the story? To be put out of the local synagogue or church, to be excommunicated, would affect your work life, the way neighbors looked at you. You would be an outcast from your family. Everyone would turn their back on you if you had been put out of the synagogue. It was a big deal. We just kind of read over it, These parents, there stands their son. I mean, he's been blind forever. You would think they would be like, "Forget y'all, Think of the position they're in. That's how bad it would be for them to be put out of the local synagogue or church. It's going to affect everything. So what do? They ask him. He's old enough. We don't want to be caught up in this. We know he's our son. And so why? Because of what it would do to you. You lose everything in society if you associated yourself with Jesus. They don't want to do that. To be associated with Jesus may cost you everything, at least in this world. We'll gain everything in the next if you give up everything here, for sure. So it'd be a costly decision for someone to follow Jesus, especially for someone of means, right? You're wealthy. They have more to lose. And so Joseph and Nicodemus were both wealthy men, we find in the scriptures. To have a tomb carved out of solid rock, he didn't go up there and carve it himself. You're talking about days and weeks and probably months of labor to carve out a new tomb. Matthew in his gospel says Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man. He was a rich man. He could afford to pay laborers to carve out his own special tomb. But no doubt this gave him even a standing with the Romans, being so wealthy. And that possibly, like I said, because of his finances. Joseph goes to Pilate, we read, and requests the body of Jesus so that he can bury him properly. Verse 39 we pick up, "And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. So we've been introduced to Nicodemus before in John's account as well. In chapter 3, if you will, turn there, if you have your scriptures or your phone or you're following along. John chapter 3. It would have been like a year ago we'd have been there. John chapter 3. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night secretly and tells Jesus that he knows that he is from God because of the miracles that Jesus had worked and because of his teaching. So John records this conversation for us. John chapter 3 verse 1 says, "There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, 'Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him.' And Jesus answered and said to him, 'Most assuredly I say to you, Unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus said to him, well, how can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? And Jesus answered, most assuredly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. And Nicodemus answered and said to him, how can these things be? And Jesus answered and said to him, are you the teacher of Israel? In other words, a very high position. And do not know these things? Most assuredly, I say to you, we speak what we know and testify what we have seen, and you do not receive our witness. If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended to heaven but he who came down from heaven, and that is the Son of Man who is in heaven. Notice this next verse. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. You know that Nicodemus later at the cross remembers this conversation with Jesus. He came to him at night, alone. I want to talk to the Lord, see what he has to say. He's been secret. He's been hiding out. Comes to him at night. Didn't want anybody to know what he's doing. He remembers this conversation. He remembers Jesus says, the Son of Man will be lifted up. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. So what's Jesus talking about when he says this? Well, Nicodemus, being the teacher of Israel, as Jesus referred to him, would have known. Numbers 21, we read where the children of Israel became discouraged in the wilderness. You remember the story? And they sinned by speaking against God and against Moses. And so the judgment for their unbelief and sin was that the Lord sent, what? Fiery serpents among them. Now, many people were bitten by these fiery serpents and died. Now, if you live up here, you know what a rattlesnake is. I'm sure Joe does, running around in the mountains. You know what a copperhead is. If you live out here, for sure, you know what a copperhead is. And I've seen National Geographic, so I've seen black mambas, but I have no idea what a fiery serpent is, but it sounds bad. Real bad, all right? Never seen a fiery serpent, but pretty sure you don't want one in your backyard. So the people come to Moses, and they confess that they've sinned. People are dying. They're getting bit by these snakes. They confess that they've sinned. And they ask Moses to pray that the snakes will be taken away. And so the Lord hears their prayer. And he has mercy on them, and he gives to Moses the prescription for their sin. What does he say? Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. And it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. And Jesus tells Nicodemus long before the crucifixion, long before the cross, long before this ugly business, long before Nicodemus sees him hanging there. See, Nicodemus is going to take Jesus down. He's been hiding out, right? Kind of been secret. Go talk to Jesus at night one time. Talk to him. What did Jesus say? He said, you remember the story? You remember how the snake was on the pole and you held it up, and everybody that looks at that, they're going to be saved, right? Now Nicodemus is remembering this night. He's seen the words of Jesus fulfilled, just as he said. And the blessing for the children of Israel was that they didn't have to do anything to be healed, did they? They didn't have to suck the poison out or put a tourniquet on, or what'd they do? Just believe. You've been bitten? Walk out of your tent and look at it. Gaze on it, and you'll be healed. You'll be saved. Poison won't affect you, is what they were told. And what Jesus told Nicodemus, just like that, the Son of Man will be lifted up. He'll be hanging there for all to see. And those who look at that, they'll be saved. Those who believe. Because you had to believe to walk out of your tent. I mean, it'd be a whole lot easier. I got bit by that stupid snake, right? If I walk out there and look at that thing, it ain't going to save me. You know? What's he talking about, right? Do you believe? Do you believe what Jesus did for you is enough? Nicodemus, remembering that conversation from that night. All that we have to do to be healed from the bite of Satan right? Healed from our sin is to look on the cross, believe what Jesus has done for us, and we'll be healed from the bite of sin. Look at the cross. Look at what Jesus has done. Believe. Believe enough to look and keep your eyes there. And here these men are, right? Going to Pilate, remembering all that they've seen Jesus do, remembering all the teaching that they've heard from him, recognizing that this guy's from somewhere else. This guy is from somewhere else. And they take his body down from the cross. What a scene. Smells, the sights, the noise. They pry the nails out of his hands and feet. Verse 40 says, Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb which no one had yet been laid. So there they laid Jesus, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby. And David Guzik in his commentary points out what preparing the body properly for the burial would have been like for these men. He says they would have examined his entire body and found broken pieces of thorn all over his head. They saw his bloody matted hair, terrible bruising of the face, areas of the beard pulled out, the dry and cracked lips. And they turned the body over to see his shoulders and arms are riddled with splinters, each one removed with care. The back from the shoulders down was a bloody open wound from the terrible scourging suffered before the crucifixion. His hands and feet smashed and bloodied. On the front, just beneath the rib cage, a gaping wound made from the spear thrust that confirmed his death. And yet, worst of all, the eyes that did not open and the voice that did not speak. Both of these men, although secret disciples earlier, had spoken up for Jesus at one point. Both of them had. But they would be spoken over and disregarded by their peers. In John 7, Nicodemus speaks up for Jesus and tells his fellow Pharisees, he says, our law does not judge a man before we hear him out and know what he's doing. So he kind of steps out there, throws something out. And they turn around and silence him, we read. They say a snide remark, are you also from Galilee? Basically just shut him down, right? And he doesn't say anymore. Joseph of Arimathea also had a moment of courage in Luke 23, where Luke describes Joseph. It says he's a good and just man. Good and just. Got a good reputation. It says he had not consented to the council's push for Jesus to be killed. Joseph of Arimathea took a stand in that group. He said, I don't think we should crucify him. You know? Taking a small stand. And it's kind of like when you get up the courage to bow your head at McDonald's, right? You have those moments, you're like, that's a lot of people in here. Okay, let's do it. You know, and if there's 4 or 5 of you, you don't, especially if you're a bunch of guys, you're like, what? What are you going to say? You know, praying over here, knock it off. Pray for you too. It's easy, isn't it? Really. Sometimes we have a struggle with that, but it's easy. No real threat. Or like when we used to sit at McDonald's. I forgot we don't sit in McDonald's anymore. But it didn't really cost us anything to do that, did it? It didn't really cost us anything. Maybe somebody looks at you, laughs at you, whatever, you know. It didn't cost us anything. We didn't face the possibility of jail to bow our head at McDonald's. No real threat to our jobs. And we didn't face the possibility of being locked up like Paul and Silas. Yet. I think yet. I could be surprised, but it seems that our nation's running downhill just as fast as it can. So I'm praying that the Lord turns it around. We keep our freedoms of religion, especially, because that affects everything else. If that's gone, forget it. So these men now step forward to be associated with Jesus. After all this, they step forward. Total abandon of their social status now, venturing out in faith for Jesus, even to the point of facing excommunication from the synagogue. That still stood. That fact was still there. If you associate with him, you're kicked out. These guys are on the councils. These guys are wealthy. They've been told, you associate with him, you're gone. Make no mistake, this move to care for the body of Jesus would put a target on their backs, for sure. So what changed? What happened that these well-off rich rulers decided that Jesus is worth it? He's worth everything. He's worth risking it all for. And we aren't sure what happened to these men after taking this stand. We don't read in the scriptures, but there is some secular history that says that they did lose all their wealth and positions. I remember listening to one even said that one of their, I forget which one it was, but his sister had had a very opulent wedding, very well off, very, very well to do before this. And once he associated with Jesus at this point later, totally broke. She was actually, there's a story of her out beating barley out of the field trying to find something to eat. You know, family outcast after this. Like I said, you won't find that in scripture, but there is some history that says that they did suffer to be kicked out of their positions and lost their wealth because of this. Joseph of Arimathea actually fulfilled an Old Testament prophecy found in Isaiah 53. The prophet there writes, speaking of this day of the crucifixion, he says, and they made his grave with the wicked. Speaking of what would happen with Jesus, it says, but with the rich at his death. Talking about where he'd be buried. Jesus would be buried in a rich man's tomb. So Joseph of Arimathea, fulfilling prophetic words concerning Jesus, and that probably unknowingly, he's just doing what was right. You know, but that conviction carried the possibility of it costing him everything in this world to do what was right. And somehow after watching Jesus on that cross, they realize he's worth it. We've been secret. We've kind of been hiding it. You know, we've been going and talking to him at night, but he's worth it. I'm sure that the earthquakes that day that we read of in the other Gospels, the supernatural darkness in the middle of the day, and the fact that the veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom, I'd say that probably spurred their boldness on a little too. You got a lot going on that day. You know, they're thinking, yeah, I believe he is the Son of God. I think we'll just go ahead and leave all our wealth and social status and go on and bury him, you know. I think they were emboldened by what happened. Life can have a way of forcing you to live your faith, can it? You make a decision. Step up or step down. Life can have a way of doing that. All of Jesus' disciples who thought they would be there for him flaked out. We looked at that, and the secret disciples stepped up. Life has a way of exposing our weaknesses and our faith, and it has a way of making some step up. They weren't relying on themselves, I believe, you know. Although they had been hiding out, kind of keeping it on the down low, now they were put in a position, we got to make a decision. And what did it do? It brought out the good. We're going to step up, even if it costs us everything. Peter, remember what he said? I won't leave you, Lord. Where's he at? Gone like a feather in the wind, right? Where's Peter at? Of course, he comes back. God's gracious. He heals him, brings him back. But the thought of the cross, seeing what happened that day, emboldened them. The love of Jesus and his willingness to lay down his life for us and them gave them the courage to take a stand. They saw the cross. Just like the children of Israel were to look at the brass snake on the pole in order to be saved from the bite of the serpent, as Christians, we are to look at the cross of Christ to be able to overcome in this world. You think, is it really that easy? Surely there's got to be more to it. Surely we got to come up with some kind of our strength and make it. Nope. Just keep your eyes on the cross. Just remember what Jesus did for you. You'll be fine if you do that. It's not about being strong. It's not about finding it in yourself. Because you may be like Peter. You may find it's not there when you think it is. But if you're looking at the cross like these guys, you'll make it. If it costs you something, you'll be all right. Jesus said in Luke 9, directly after predicting his own crucifixion and resurrection, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will what? Lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will what? Find it. You'll find it. For what profit is a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? What's a soul worth? Jesus said it's worth more than the whole world. Your soul's worth more than the whole world. If we could take the whole world and give it to you, you can do whatever you want with it, all the riches in it, everything else. He says, what good is it if you lose your soul? He laid out the value of the human soul in that statement, I believe. He says, you can take everything that the world has, and it still ain't worth it. What would it profit these two men if they held on to their status and riches or felt embarrassed to be associated with Jesus? You get a nice carved out tomb and that's it, right? Instead, like these men, do we realize that there's coming a time to take up our own cross in this life? I think we're going to face that, church. And, I know we want to come here and be encouraged, right? I always find that battle, the struggle. Like, how do I encourage people, but you're still warning people? Because I have to answer for that one day. If I come up here and tell you about how good everything is, and I don't want to go there, but your best life now, I'm misleading you. Do we have to be afraid? No. Just live in reality. Understand the world is what Jesus said it is. Don't be surprised. We've been very blessed in this nation, haven't we? Thankful. I'm praying that it continues. I'm praying that the correct leadership gets in there, that all that keeps working out and we have that freedom. But our brothers and sisters don't today, many of them around the world. So don't be surprised if we have to take up a new cross, a cross that looks different than it has in this nation. I'll read the headlines now, and I'm very surprised at what people say about Christians openly. I'm not surprised, but I notice it's a new norm. It's a new norm. And so it seems like this ship is heading a way we haven't seen before. Joseph and Nicodemus, Jesus said what? He said, take up your cross and follow me. In other words, I'll go first. And he said that before he did it, before they really understood what he was going to do. He made these statements that they got to look back and say, oh, that's what he meant. When he said take up his cross, he really meant take up his cross. Well, he said, take up your cross and you go first. Nope. He said, take up your cross and follow me. And that's what these guys remembered. How do we do this? How do we step out? What if it cost us everything to step out? How did Jesus do it? Sold out. Knew that this life is what it is. I'm going to go I'm going back to glory. I'm leaving here. That's what happens to us. What are they going to do? Kill us? Like the Christian's the most dangerous person in the world. You know why? Not because we're going to do something crazy, but because what? You're going to send me to heaven? I don't have a death wish. I'm here as long as the Lord wants me here, but I also understand I win. I win because of Christ. I win because of that cross. I'm skipping so much of this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, the figure of the crucified invalidates all thought which takes success for its standard. My translation of that would be the cross takes what the world calls success and it reveals it for the foolishness it is. You think worldly success? I have worked in I've worked in houses that are millions of dollars with the guy that I work for. And I'm thankful for that job and thankful for those people, and I'm glad they're spending their money because it's feeding my hungry kids, right? No different, I'm telling you. Without Jesus, as miserable and caught up in trying to just enjoy a moment, and they're going to lay in a hole just like me. Doesn't matter how much money they have, right? It's not bad to be blessed. These guys were blessed. God had given them much. It's not a bad thing, but if that's where your hope's at, if you think this world will satisfy you, just like the song, it's a well that will run dry. And you can drink from that money well and then think, well, I'll run over here and drink from this alcohol well. And I'll run over here and I'll drink from this well of sex, and I'll drink from this well of drugs. And you'll be thirsty every time. What Jesus say? Come to me and you'll thirst no more. You drink from this and you won't thirst again. I'll satisfy you once you understand that. Paul Harvey, if you know who that is, you're probably over 35. Paul Harvey shared this story. He said, one summer morning as Ray Blankenship was preparing his breakfast, he gazed out the window and he saw a small girl being swept along in the rain-flooded drainage ditch beside his Andover, Ohio home. So Blankenship knew that further downstream the ditch disappeared with a roar underneath the road and then emptied into a main culvert. So Ray dashed out the door and raced along the ditch, trying to get ahead of the foundering child. He then hurled himself into the deep churning water. Blankenship surfaced and was able to grab the child's arm. They tumbled end over end. Within about 3 feet of the yawning culvert, Ray's free hand felt something, possibly a rock, protruding from the bank, and he clung desperately. But the tremendous force of the water tried to tear him and the child away. He said, "If I can just hang on until help comes," he thought. He did better than that. By the time the fire department rescuers arrived, Blankenship had pulled the girl to safety. Both were treated for shock. On April 12, 1989, Ray Blankenship was awarded the Coast Guard Silver Life-Saving Medal. You see, the award is fitting, for this selfless person was at even greater risk to himself than most people knew. Ray Blankenship couldn't swim. He couldn't swim. He couldn't do it. You know, I think as we go on, there may be moments where we feel like that. This world's like overwhelming, you know, especially if you're going to be the Christian and you're not going to go along with what everybody else is saying and you're going to be different and you're going to stand out there. You know, it's going to be overwhelming. Can I do this? Like, I can't swim in this. I can't swim. I think the cross in front of us may be different than what we've experienced in this nation so far. It may look like a roaring torrent to us at times. It has the potential to destroy us, we may think. It's an overwhelming thought of, how will I? You know, well, what if this happens? Or, I don't think I can. Trust Jesus. Keep your eyes on the cross. It's that simple. And what he's done for you. And like Ray Blankenship, just jump in. He'll show up. He will show up. I read too many stories of little girls laying down their life for Christ to not think that he'll show up for me. Now, if I think I'm going to do it on my own, I'll be like Peter. Where's Clint? It's like a feather in the wind. He got scared and ran off. You know, with the Lord's help. Put my eyes on the cross. We'll be fine. Amen.